So on behalf of arXiv, welcome everybody, welcome panelists, welcome guests. My name is Shamsi Brin. I work at arXiv. I do user experience. And I just wanted to share a little bit before we go into introductions about what to expect at this session. So this session, of course, we'll be discussing accessibility, but we also want to make the session as accessible as possible. So there's a few changes we've made. One of those is that the chat, if you're a guest, you'll notice that the chat is off. And that is because it's very noisy and disruptive for screen readers. But you might also notice that the Q&A tab is on, and we do welcome you to use the Q&A tab to ask questions. We'll be keeping an eye on that and getting to as many of those as we can when we reach the Q&A portion of the event. This session has 3 parts. We're going to start with introductions and some lightning talks from our panelists, take a short break. We'll come back and do a panel discussion based on questions that were asked in advance, take a second short break, and then come back for Q&A that has been coming in live from the audience. So it should be a lot of fun. I want to mention that there's a discussion board on the session website that can be used to open up side conversations or to keep discussions going beyond this actual session. Please feel free to use that. It won't be disruptive at all to the Zoom webinar because that's over on the forum website. And just wanted to mention also that we're going to try and maintain more deliberate pacing, not rush through our content. This is helpful for learning in general, helpful for all of us, and also really essential when you have translation happening, which we will have at every session of the arXiv forum. So those are the notes that I wanted to share. Why don't we move into introductions? I'm wondering if you could start us off, Anne.
Certainly. Hi, everyone. I'm Anne here. I graduated from Cornell University with my PhD in May of 2023. A huge accomplishment. I majored in horticulture, focusing on viticulture and enology. I am deaf. I tend to use SynCom for communication. I generally use my voice and sign at the same time. For this program, I am voice off and relying on my interpreters to voice so that communication is clear for all. And I'll expand on that later. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Venkatesh, could you tell us a little about yourself?
Yes. Hi, everybody. I am Venkatesh Potluri. I am an assistant professor in the School of Information at the University of Michigan. I graduated from the Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering at University of Washington a couple of months ago. Again, they're super thrilled about that. But yeah, that's me.
Thanks so much, Venkatesh. Jonathan, tell us a little about yourself.
Good morning, everybody. You'll see from the time zone reference that I am not based in the US. I'm actually in New Zealand. That's my country of birth and country of everything. I am now working at Massey University as a lecturer in the statistics group. I completed my PhD in statistics about 20 years ago, just over, and I have been teaching undergraduate students, supervising postgrad students, interacting with research collaborations, and all the normal things that academics are supposed to be doing over the last 20 odd years. Great to be with you. I think that one of my few claims to fame would be that, as far as we are aware, I was the first totally blind person to gain employment as an academic in a statistics group full-time back 20 odd something years ago. And there haven't been many others since. Yeah, so that's something I didn't come to understand until much later, when the others started contacting me and asking me for my assistance. I never thought that I would be the first to do anything. It wasn't on the plan, but it is what happened. Great to be with you.
Thanks for sharing that, Jonathan. Next, we're going to move into some brief lightning talks. So as you know, the title of the session is Ask Me Anything, and our three panelists have shared with me the message that there are no silly questions, but they wanted to begin with some lightning talks to just describe some basics of the ways that they tackle their environments. And as you're listening to these interesting talks, please feel free to jot down questions that come up for you in the Q&A tab. We'll be keeping an eye on that and gathering them over the breaks to use later on during the Q&A session. And let's see, Venkatesh is going to go first with his lightning talk. Oh, Venkatesh, hold on one second. You're muted. Oh, you're unmuted now. Go ahead.
Cool. Hi, everybody. This is Venkatesh again. So to me, research is a process that starts with a curiosity-driven, unstructured, and sometimes maybe even slightly chaotic series of experiments and investigations that beautifully fall into place to form a cohesive, structured way of systematically understanding and improving something about the world. So me talking about how I go about this process of doing research may not be as structured as you all hoped it to, may not be, as structured as you all hope for it to be to begin with, but hopefully by the end of the next hour and a half, it'll all, come together and form a cohesive understanding of accessibility and research to all of you. My research uses qualitative, ethnographic, and data-driven methods to understand the accessibility of the world out there. I also contribute data sets and real-world systems to improve accessibility for people with disabilities. I am blind, so I use computers with accessibility technology called screen readers. Simply put, these screen readers convert graphical and text-based content on screen into synthesized speech, and if you have additional hardware, into refreshable braille that you can touch, feel, and read. When doing research, a lot of times my collaborators and I use the same tools that you would expect to use to perform a specific task. For example, I use Microsoft's Visual Studio Code. I'm a huge fan because they've gone to great lengths to ensure that their developer tools are accessible. And this makes collaborating with colleagues very easy on software development tasks that I also do as a part of my research. Other times, my collaborators and I have to make slight modifications to processes to make them accessible to everybody on the team. For example, when using a shared collaboration platform, we use Overleaf a lot for writing papers. I use the Git endpoint of the Overleaf, whereas my collaborators use the web interface because the web interface is not screen reader accessible. But when one of us is using Git and when the other people are editing real time, we might run into merge conflicts. So we come up with a strategy where I take locks for each different file that I would like to work on, and we organize the paper in such a way that each section has a different file, is written in a different file, and then we collaborate still very effectively. Slight changes, but we all do it. Other times we have to my collaborators and I go around, come up with like completely new and creative ways of doing something. For example, we repurpose Google Docs and spreadsheets and other text-based software to do qualitative analysis. I must give a shout out to my other blind colleagues who are not in this room for like giving me a suggestion to follow that method. And other times we are using Python files instead of Jupyter notebooks to make, to do data science projects. So yeah, basically these are just some of the ways in which, some of the tools that I use to conduct research, and some of the things that my colleagues and I do to make research accessible. Inaccessibility of research-based tools is very frustrating, because they force my team and I to focus on how to do a task that we're already an expert in, as opposed to focusing time and energy on doing the actual task itself. And these accessibility issues sometimes are the least interesting and very frustrating. It's 2024, and we still find buttons in web-based research tools unlabeled. This labeling buttons, which, by the way, is a web development best practice. And unlabeled buttons don't cause a screen reader user to not know what a particular button does. Other times, I find research papers that are not accessible, where tables are not marked up, or important figures are not described. So, it takes slightly more time and effort to kind of build on top of the cool research my other academic colleagues are doing. This is just, some of the many ways in which I do research. It's not an exhaustive list, but I hope to, answer more questions that you all have are going to be coming up with over the next hour. Thanks.
Thank you, Venkatesh. That was wonderful. Next up, Anne is going to share her lightning talk.
Okay, let me start with my research, and then I'll talk about accessibility accommodations and what I used at Cornell to succeed. First of all, my research right now, I'm finishing up some editings on my last chapter of my dissertation, and I'm waiting on some co-authors to publish that. Really exciting. It's nice to have a PhD, but there's ongoing work that's required for that, and my advisor is still requesting some things from me. But my PhD focused on above ground canopy management and techniques and practices for summer pruning, hedging in vineyards. There are two other techniques, shoot wrap and shoot tuck. One is wrapping around the top wire, and one is wrapping among the wires. So there's a top catch wire, and then there are any number of wires below that. So shoot wrap is along the top wire, and shoot tuck is among all the wires below the catch wire. So I focused on the impact of above and below ground growth, root growth, and root dynamics, and how root life expanded production or contributed to the death of vines. I also focused on yield management and vegetative growth, and how to manage vegetative growth in the vines above ground. My current research interests are, I am part of a deaf hearing collaborative team that's working on an educational software app. It's a game app to support teaching deaf children science concepts in American Sign Language. I'm also setting up my own wine education classes in American Sign Language, both for in-person and online learning. And I'm working my way toward a one-day collaboration with a wine and grape institute in New England to develop a Cornell University and New England-wide education program, because there's absolutely nothing available out there for wine education in ASL. Now I'd like to move on to my accessibility accommodations and what I needed to be successful at Cornell University while studying for my PhD. Obviously, I have sign language interpreters. I also utilize captioning or CART. So it's real-time captioning, a transcription of what is being spoken in the classroom. I also had auto transcription for informal settings in the field or in the lab to help, because I can lip read, but it is an imperfect system to be sure. There were some people who signed that were on my team and in my research scope, but not all. So I had my accommodations in line that benefited me greatly during my studies. And when I work in collaboration now, I often have to ask a great deal of questions, more than you would expect. Because as a deaf person, and goes for the deaf community in general, we're highly intelligent, highly successful people, but because we cannot hear and there's auditory processing that does not happen, there is incidental learning that does not occur. And what that means is that people often learn things by overhearing others speaking and saying, oh, that's how I'm supposed to do this, or oh, that's what's going on right now. Deaf people don't get that at all. It's called incidental learning, and we miss out on it. So I have to ask a lot more questions because I'm deaf. And it requires patience from my team and the people around me. And a lot of people are still learning. So that's why this type of forum is wonderful. It's never a better time to sort of open your mind to different perspectives and different ways of learning. Thank you for letting me be here.
Thank you so much, Anne. Let's move on to Jonathan's lightning talk.
Cool. So I mentioned before that I finished a PhD 20 odd years ago, and access and accessibility has changed dramatically over the years in between. And I have to say that my job is considerably easier today than it was back then. It's even much easier than it was even 10 years ago, and even 5 years ago. When I was a grad student, I was given an opportunity to become a teaching assistant. It was recognised by the staff in my academic unit at that time that I could add value to the team. I didn't do the same work as all the other teaching assistants. Quite clearly, I managed to dip out on doing all of the assignment marking in particular, because in the 20th century, most people were using pen and paper, or maybe even a computer, but still printing it onto paper. So I missed out on all the marking, and for that I'm eternally grateful, because it meant that I ended up doing more of the interactive sessions with students in computer labs or tutorial classrooms, talking to them, helping them out, making sure that they were able to complete their work, hopefully happier. So I was given a chance, and that very definitely made a difference, but not so much as just being given a chance. I took the chance. And so my big message to anyone who is worried about their inferiority is get over it, take the chance, take the opportunities that are given to you, fight for them, make them happen. And if you're a decision maker who gets the chance to create opportunities, I would like you to take a leaf out of my colleague's book and give people a chance. When I think back to being a PhD student, I used to have to go off to the library with my volunteers, track down the physical journal and open the big volume. read abstract after abstract of potential article that we might want to read in more detail later. And I think of the hours I spent standing around next to photocopiers so that we could read the articles later. The hours that I spent pulling large volumes, tomes, off dusty shelves in libraries. And I look back at that and go, life is so much better today because I am now reading articles at will. I am tracing across journals and things like that, just the way that my sighted colleagues are doing when they want to do literature searches. I have to say that now that my students are submitting work in accessible formats, I actually have to do more of my own marking as well. So accessibility has come with a bit more responsibility. Well, I still have the responsibility then. I just had to get someone to read those assignments to me. Today, I can do the marking when I want to, not when I can find someone to read something to me. Today's world, we are in an online environment for teaching. I don't always like it, but that's the way it is. And I have to do recordings and be online and do interactions just like my colleagues. The expectations are the same, and that's what they should be. The same expectations, the same responsibilities. And I pretty much do everything in the same way that my colleagues do, although there might be some minor differences sneaking in behind the scenes. You will notice that I do wear an earpiece. That is because I need to listen to the screen reader that blind people are using. You don't. And so it's my responsibility to make sure I have my access working for me and that I am then able to make sure that I and you are paying attention to the main reason why we are in an interaction environment. So I've made sure that I've got the solutions to work with people like you. That was always my responsibility. And actually, more often than not, I was also the expert in finding those solutions. The tools that I needed in order to do work as a statistician, that I needed to develop for myself because they didn't exist. The tools that I needed are now shared so that other blind people can benefit from them as well. And there are plenty of other examples where people have taken ideas like mine, moved forward, wanted more, and advanced the general accessibility of data, data science, statistics, and STEM in general. It should be quite obvious that as a blind person, I don't, more realistically, can't rely on graphs and other visual media in the same way. That doesn't mean that I can't do the same job. It means that I do it differently. And I've got my tools. And maybe if we work together, you end up seeing my tools in the background. I'm going to reflect on a critical moment in my past. And it was when I hadn't started a PhD and I was wondering what I was going to do with my life. I was in my 20s, unemployed, well, happily unemployed. I was still a student having a really good time, thank you. But I really thought that being a student was going to end at some point and that employment was probably the right thing to be doing. And I had no idea of what that might look like. The unemployment rate for blind people remains high. So I went off to a statistics conference in order to sort of find myself, as it were, to look at all the people around me and decide if the jobs that they were doing were the sorts of things that I wanted to do. And I remember one key interaction at that conference. The interaction was with an American named Doug Zahn. He was at the conference as an expert in statistical consulting, and he was offering advice to people just like me, grad students, about doing statistical consulting in their futures. He went out of his way to offer me advice that was unique to my circumstances. Thought about what it was to be like for me and how I would be able to do statistical consulting interactions in future. And I remember his words, and I'm paraphrasing them. Jonathan, you already have an advantage over these other students. You know how to listen to people. That advice holds true for me today. I am still interacting with postgraduate students, faculty members around campus who need statistical advice. I'm sure some of them get a bit of a surprise when they walk into my office for a meeting and discover there's a guide dog, and it's not a dog in training, it's Jonathan's dog. And so they have to refocus things pretty quickly. Of course, there's no secrets about my blindness. It's all over the internet. You know, it's not a big deal for me. So I don't tell everyone, oh, by the way, look out, I'm blind, before they come to my office. So the interaction is different. It's unique to my way of working, but it works. And I'd have to say that the track record says it's been successful, and that in the end is what matters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. We are going to take a short 5-minute break now, and when we return, we'll have a panel discussion where we address some of the questions that had come in ahead of time. So see you back here in 5. Welcome back, everybody. That 5 minutes went by very fast. Before we continue on to the panel discussion, I realized that I forgot to mention something for the attendees, which is we have volunteers who are taking live notes in an open Google document. And we wanted to share that just as a resource. If you missed something, if you want to check in on something that was said, I'm just going to post that to the chat. Might be a little disruptive for screen reader users, and chat should be quiet again now. So I just wanted to share that link before we move on. And what we're going to do now is a panel discussion where we're going to share out some of the questions that attendees posed ahead of time with our 3 panelists. And I wanted to start with Venkatesh with this question. As a student, what were some of the key tools, curriculum, or interactions that were helpful for you or not helpful? So they're asking about tools, yes, curriculum, and interactions.
Right. 1 second.
You just went on mute. Would you like me to try and unmute?
Yes, I think, yeah, sorry. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So just to repeat the question, as a student, what were some of the interactions or things that were useful or not, right? Like tools, right?
Tools, curriculum, interactions.
Yeah. So I'll talk about all 3 of them. So with respect to tools, with respect to tools, I use a screen reader, as I mentioned, but there are also other tools that I use. One of the more interesting things has been access to an in-person and remote visual interpreter. I use a service called Ira, which is a remote visual interpreting service where you can get connected to a remote person on a video call. They can also see your GPS and such, and that was useful to both make slides in the very last minute. No matter how hard I planned, I ended up in those situations sometimes. And they also had, that service also helped with navigating unfamiliar hotel rooms or conference venues when I was out traveling to give talks or present my work. So that's been one example. as a, one thing that did not work in terms of tools is that sometimes a lot of the tools that I would like to use were not accessible. So this required my collaborators and I to put in a lot of time in figuring out how to do things differently. Like, and other times this had also turned into, this has turned into an opportunity for me to do research. Not, yeah, though it is still, the lack of access was still frustrating, especially when developer tools often caused accessibility issues. They resulted in a research project. A lot of my work is in the accessibility of developer tools for blind or visually impaired people. But to be more concrete, an example of a tool that could would have made life easy if it were accessible would be Overleaf, for example, right? Like the web interface. At the same time, there is also there is to my knowledge no accessible reference manager out there. So a lot of the benefits that you would get from that wouldn't be helpful. A little bit about people and other interactions. The one of the things that constantly kept being inaccessible, and we and people have tried to do a lot of work, is classrooms and courses specifically, right? What happens is that a lot of times we're trying to make courses accessible once somebody asks for them. So this is a time-consuming process. And if material were born accessible, if course material were already accessible, they would have like really been helpful. And interactions that helped in this situation were from instructors, advisors, the disability resources departments, who were willing to understand the situation, put in the effort themselves to go deep into making things accessible. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks so much, Venkatesh. That was wonderful. Our next question is for Anne. Anne, what do you wish your teachers knew when you were a student? And what are you bringing into your teaching work that other professors can learn from?
That's a good question. Actions speak louder than words. And why do I say that? My PhD advisor is a wonderful human being, and I have a great deal of respect for her and some of the other people on my research team. It was a learning experience. There was one professor whose name I shall not mention, who I approached with a question. I was asking to make sure that there was captioning, or that the video had auto transcript turned on so that I could have access to the materials before we start the semester, or working with the disability office. And the person that I approached emailed me and said, please ask the Student Disability Services office yourself to fulfill that request. And that was a little stymieing. Not so disability friendly. I mean, I guess I wonder, what are your thoughts on that? Because, I mean, if I have to lose time and take time away from my research to do accommodation work that others could take responsibility for, and I should not always have to make the effort to make things accessible for myself. Other people should take on that work as well. The other thing that I wish is that people could, professors and instructors, I wish that they could be aware that signing for specific scientific terminology is still in the developmental phase. So there is a new ASL core dictionary for scientific terms, and those signs are still in the development process. So I had to kind of develop my own signs within my field. I am the first deaf person in the horticulture, viticulture, and enology field. So I had to come up with signs. I had some professors who would say to me, "Oh, Anne, it looks to me like you have a learning disability," because they were misunderstanding the needs of a deaf student and the gaps between the lecturer and the interpreter, making up signs on the spot that were hopefully biologically, conceptually accurate. Plus, the captioning was sometimes less than perfect. So I got my PhD from an absolutely outstanding university, and I do not have a learning disability. My ears don't work. That's the only thing. But I think that people who have disabilities who take up higher degrees are problem solvers because we need to be.
Thank you for that, Anne. Before I move on to my next question that I'll field to Jonathan, I wanted to follow up on the question that Anne posed for the fellow panelists, which, if I'm remembering right, was around whose responsibility is it to follow up with disability services? Whose responsibility is it to help students overcome obstacles that they may encounter in their path? I wonder if Jonathan and then Venkatesh, if you could share your thoughts on that.
Perhaps mine's probably simpler because when I was an undergraduate student, there was no such thing as a disability support service. There was one staff member who had 6 hours a week to support the needs of 500 students. So it was a case of Jonathan needs, Jonathan must. So yeah. That meant that at the beginning of term, I would pluck up the courage to stand up in front of a class of anything from 20 to 200 students and ask if there were any volunteers who wanted to read the course material to me. And often that was a complete resounding failure, but I was ultimately never short of volunteers in that time. And I was using 10 to 15 people per week for 1 hour each. And often it was of great benefit to those students because it forced them into a routine and forced them to actually read the course material. So the responsibility was mine because there was no alternative.
And I'm wondering, Jonathan, just reflecting on what you see today at your university, any thoughts from that perspective? How do you think it should work?
When you're fresh to university, everything is new. And so I think faculty have a responsibility to make sure that the transition into that environment is as easy as possible. But by the time, and therefore they should give plenty of support, but by the time a disabled student is looking to leave university and move off to employment, they are going to have needed to have started to solve many of the problems for themselves or know how to find the solutions, not necessarily have a solution right now, but at least have a strategy for how they're going to find a solution when they don't have the answer on hand. That's a maturity thing. And you know, your prospective employer is going to wonder, this is a reality for disabled people, your prospective employer is going to wonder how much they are going to have to mollycoddle or look after you. So you have to be able to prove to a prospective employer that you don't need extensive babysitting compared to a non-disabled colleague. And I think that those attitude problems are going to exist for some time. And therefore, those of us who have been successful have probably learned how to bite our tongue, hold back the comments. You know, you're allowed to think, you stupid. you aren't allowed to say it to your prospective employer. So I think those of us who have a success story can look back and go, I had to suck it up at that time. I shouldn't have to do that again. But you've got to live in the moment, and play the game as it is at this point in time. I would seriously hope that attitudes towards employing disabled people have advanced considerably. But then again, I look at the unemployment rates of disabled people who are professionals, and I'm still left wondering why we are suffering for underemployment.
Thank you for sharing that, Jonathan. Venkatesh, do you have any thoughts on that question about whose responsibility?
Yes. So here's the thing, right? I actually think that it is the responsibility of educators, us as educators, or teachers, to ensure that classrooms, course material, and content is accessible. And I have been fortunate to have received mentorship throughout my life, especially during my PhD, where I have had, my advisor and mentor who has not only, helped advocate for my accessibility needs when my voice was not being heard, but also helped me grow in the number of ways in which I, was able to advocate for myself. So in some ways, I will probably say the same thing Jonathan said in a slightly different way, in that I think the ideal is that we have, we have environments where we don't need to kind of quote unquote ask for disability accommodations. But to get there, I think we also will need to learn. I mean, yeah, having the skill to advocate for ourselves is also very important in that process.
Yeah, Shamsi, I'd just like to say, I have to make my course materials accessible because I need to be able to use them myself.
Yes.
And if my colleagues were all making their course material accessible in a born accessible sense, we'd all be better off. The reality we have, though, is that far too many people don't know how to do that. They don't know how to make it accessible, and maybe the accessibility they've already built in is somewhat accidental. So we need champions in accessibility to help guide faculty. We need people to understand that accessibility is important, and that yes, as an educator and an educational organisation, I and my university have a responsibility to make sure that every student who comes through the front door can use the service we provide, education.
One small detail.
I'm not an expert in every other impairment and every person's needs, and being ready to be flexible and meet someone halfway is a critical attitude for every faculty member to possess. And I can think back to an undergraduate assignment in pure mathematics. Axiomatic geometry was the name of the course. And for the life of me, I could not find any volunteer who was capable of creating the artwork that was required for an assignment. And so I went to my professor and I said, this is the problem I've had, this is what I've tried. And given that I'm trying to speak to these people about what it is I want to depict, I'd like to cut out the middleman. How about I tell you what I want in my assignment, and you listen to me and mark me. I want to submit my assignment orally instead of in writing. And he said, can you give me a while to think about it? And I had got maybe 20 meters down the corridor before he called me back and said yes. He said yes, because he didn't have a better plan.
Mm.
And it was a fantastic interaction. I have to say, it was really, really enjoyable.
Mm. Thanks for sharing that, Jonathan. I know, Venkatesh, you want to share something, and then let's circle back to Anne after Venkatesh. And
Yes, one other important thing I want to mention in thinking about accessibility and responsibility of making things accessible is that sometimes the tools and infrastructures that we need to use to make things accessible themselves are not accessible to somebody who wants to do the work. So, as tool builders, it's something to think about, but also as larger, bodies, say workplaces or, academic institutions, it's important to think about how to provide supports in these spaces as well, where the tools to make things accessible themselves are not accessible.
Thanks,
I agree.
Venkatesh. And just wanted to circle back to Anne, a fascinating discussion that you kicked off. Any thoughts that have been sparked for you?
No, I'm taking it all in and learning things as well. I'm really enjoying the conversation. Basically, I'm in complete agreement with Jonathan. His comments really resonated with me. Sometimes you have to meet people halfway, for sure. These are questions that I sometimes still grapple with. There are people who want to help and they don't know how. And there are people who need help, but don't know how to ask. I'm working in a deaf hearing team right now on a collaboration to make video content for deaf students and students with autism and others who use sign language to communicate. I'm noticing that my experience is that if we meet each other halfway, so the hearing team members, the other perspectives, they are so willing to develop a better understanding of what my perspective is and what my challenges are, and they're willing to accommodate those. I think this discussion is great. The question that I have been thinking a lot about lately is AI, artificial intelligence. I just read a journal article that was saying, you have to really disclose that you use AI when you use it. I'm guilty of using AI for alt text for a variety of different things. I thought it was the best way to give detailed descriptions of graphics. So I'm open about the fact that I use AI for certain things and that I find it beneficial. Alt text can be an overwhelming task. Sometimes I want to have an interpreter voice for me, but I don't have it in the budget for my video content. And I ask AI to do that for me and to generate the captions. And I think that there are ethics involved in that. I think that it is morally acceptable to use AI in that way. Yeah, I'm becoming a content creator, and I think we need to be open and disclose when we use AI, but I think it is a tool that can be used. There are people out there who are thinking that AI is really a no-go for everything. If we're content creators, we have to create our own content, but use AI as a tool wisely, not create content via AI. So I'm wondering what the other two researchers here on the panel think about the use of AI. The use of AI in research, just to clarify, the interpreter need to clarify that.
Let's pause on that very interesting question because it's time for our second and last break. So everyone can go grab their popcorn, refill your soda, and we'll be back in 5 minutes for our open Q&A session. Well, we'll start with the session that Anne has posed, and then we'll move on to some of the questions that have been asked in the Q&A tab. We'll see everybody in 5. Welcome back, everybody. So we're going to move into the third section of this session, which is the more open Q&A. But let's start with the question that Anne asked about the use of AI, and I'm actually going to combine that with one of the questions that's been asked in the audience, which is specifically, what can I do to make my arXiv papers more accessible? And they do mention alt text for visuals, and not sure how to do that in a research paper, and that is an area that's being talked about as far as AI is concerned. So let's see, Venkatesh, do you have any thoughts on this, working in CS?
Yes, could you repeat the question?
How can I make my arXiv papers more accessible? And this question specifically calls out alt text.
Right. So first, I think including alt text if you're writing your paper in LaTeX or Word would be helpful. There is now options in LaTeX as well. In fact, arXiv has published a guide to writing LaTeX in an accessible way so that they get translated into the HTML versions of arXiv papers. That gets me excited about the second thing that I want to talk about is that papers that are uploaded on arXiv, and Shamsi, correct me if I'm wrong about any of this, but they get converted, the papers these days can get converted into HTML. So if, we as researchers can spend time to make sure that those conversions are good and they are like including the alternative text and are good, that would be fine. That would be great too. If you're asking about writing alternative texts and using AI to do so, that is something that, I mean, yes, it's absolutely, fine to use AI to write alternative texts, but it is also important to then check for the accuracy of the alt text, the length of the alt text, and just to make sure that the alt text is succinct and is accurate. Because one thing I noticed from AI models is that they're very descriptive, which is great, but not always helpful. So just making sure that the right amount of information and the right information gets included, would be helpful. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks,
May I?
Venkatesh. Yeah, Jonathan.
Look, I'm hugely appreciative that arXiv is doing HTML. We asked for it and arXiv delivered. So that's cool. And alt text is a really great question. And I'm a big fan that the only person who really knows what a visual element like a graphic is trying to convey to the audience was the person who put that graphic in the paper. What's the message that you're trying to convey as an author? And if you had to sit down with me as a blind person working in your discipline who was reading your paper, what would you want to tell me?
Mm.
And I'm busy, so don't use up 10 years of my life with every last detail. So I think that's one thing, the author responsibility ultimately, even if you use AI to help you learn how to do the process, help you get started, give you ideas, that's cool. But it's author responsibility in the end is the gold standard. But one other thing I think you can do as an author is only submit your work to environs that offer accessible content. So arXiv is now delivering on that. The major publishers deliver on that. But I did visit another preprint service yesterday where I could not find anything but the abstract to the article in an accessible form.
Mm.
So if publishers aren't delivering for all of your audience, find a better publisher.
Mm. So for authors, where you upload as well. Anne.
Yeah, I'd love to add something to the AI conversation. I've noticed that many deaf people during my teaching university courses at Gallaudet, I see that students are using AI to edit their grammatical errors. English is often a second language and a challenging language for deaf people. And it's an interesting application of AI, and it adds another layer of complexity. It is a question when, what do you think about the use of AI for people who perhaps English is a second language? Or international students, students who are still learning English, can they use AI to correct their grammar, or do you think that that's not appropriate?
I love it. I absolutely love it. I hope that my students are learning how to become people who will go off in the world and do great things. And if I don't help prepare them with today's tools, I'm letting them down. And if I don't use today's tools to their maximum potential, I'm letting myself down. So I am using AI tools and the large language models to help me do my own job, to help me do things that are fun, to help me program in a language that I was never educated in. But ultimately, the responsibility for the product is mine as the human. So when I turn around and mark a student's assignment, I'm marking them on all of the tools that they had at their disposal. And as far as I'm concerned, that includes if they want to use LLM to help them improve their work, I'm good with it. I do, though, make sure that I say to my students, you will only be given credit for ideas that are taught in this course. So if they end up using AI to go beyond the scope of what I am teaching, they don't get any credit for it. So they have to use the LLM wisely and effectively in a constraint that I can offer. And pretty quickly, I can tell if a student is relying too heavily on the AI and not relying on their own education and learning.
Anything to add to that, Venkatesh? Use of AI by students?
Yeah, I think the case that you were talking about, to edit grammar or to generate code, I think, yeah, it's absolutely, I love it too, right? I agree with Jonathan, and I think the ultimate responsibility of the content lies with you as a creator of it, no matter what AI tool you're using, and that's something to be kind of aware of, right? And use it responsibly.
Mm. So this next,
Right, yeah, no, I agree with that. And we also have to understand how to use it wisely and responsibly. I'm fluent in R coding programs for statistics, but I use AI as a tool to troubleshoot. Finding the errors and the where the errors lie, and AI has helped me a great deal in identifying the root cause of some errors. Sometimes I need help with coding. Sometimes there's a statistical model that I'd like to use, like ANOVA or linear regression or whatever, and sort of on a strange data set. And I can pose that question to AI, please write a code for that specific subset. And then I can edit it and take the responsibility to make sure there's no errors in that work. It's my responsibility for sure.
I've also seen that AI does tend to like using technical language at times. So, you get given some guidance and you actually learn from the interactions you have with the LLM. And that's what I'm referring to with, getting this guidance on how to create alt text, for example, and see what you like and what you don't like with what AI generates. But it comes back in the end, your human to human interaction. Jonathan, does this work for you? You're not going to get that out of AI. You're going to get it because you end up with human-to-human interaction and asking us as humans questions. So a great addition to the toolbox. I would say necessary, but far from sufficient.
Thanks for that interesting conversation. I want to move on to a completely different question that's been asked that's actually about physical spaces. So I'm going to first ask Jonathan and Venkatesh to weigh in, but I don't want to make any assumptions. And I would love to hear from you, Anne, as a sighted person, whether this question is relevant to you as well. So here goes. I manage design and construction projects at Cornell University. Are there tools that can be used to enable visually impaired people to read drawings or maps? An example would be to read a detour map where the usual pedestrian path has been blocked for ongoing construction activities. So a different sort of approach to the academic experience. Venkatesh, any thoughts on this?
Yes, thank you for asking about infrastructure first thing. I think it's a very important aspect of the academic experience, as no matter what role you're playing in the system. Um, so as for physical, tools, I think having tactile maps is one way to do it. There are like very specific guidelines on how to create these tactile maps, but at the same time, if the workarounds or the alternative pathways that you're talking about are very dynamic, I don't know how feasible generating tactile maps might be for situations like that. Being very clear and very descriptive and communicating those changes ahead of time via channels that are accessible, maybe via email or maybe via a text message or maybe via another instant messaging platform that that an organization uses. That would be very helpful, right? Because even tactile maps sometimes have a learning curve and not everyone might be familiar with those. So doing multiple of these would almost always be helpful.
Thanks, Venkatesh. Any thoughts from you, Jonathan?
Venkatesh has covered most of it. I think the tool that I value most is the email that says to all staff, crane operating in this area, road and all paths blocked, is the message for me to steer clear of that part of campus and on that day. And so I like the proactivity that is built into that structure. But the reality of life is that most of these construction things I don't know about until I literally stumble across them. And at that point, whether it's a member of the public or a member of the construction team, showing me the safe way around and offering some advice is the more common. It's the more common thing that's going to happen in my world, because more of these projects happen outside of that controlled campus environment than inside it. So I've got to have those solutions, right? I've got to be ready for occasionally there's going to be work being done on a footpath somewhere, and the concrete's gone. So there's a fence around that zone. So I've got to be ready for that. I've got to have and do have the skills to deal with obstacles like that.
Thanks, Jonathan.
One more thing I would like to add, is that I resonate with things that Jonathan was mentioning, right? Another thing that would be helpful is to have maybe another person over there who is able to assist with like an alternative path to get to wherever we need to get to, because sometimes it's not possible to not be on campus. Although with remote access, it's becoming more and more possible, which is great. And at the same time, it also is important to think about other access barriers that may be that these alternative paths may pose, like for other people. For example, if there is no ramp in the alternative path, is there a different alternative path with a ramp in it, or is there, if there is no option, that may be good to communicate explicitly as well, so that, ramps are very important for accessibility as well. Situations like that are also things we need to account for. And there may be better strategies out there in dealing with this. I'm not an expert, but just drawing from some of my own experiences and things I've seen with other friends and colleagues.
I'm not about to contemplate taking a taxi across campus, but I have been known to delay my arrival on campus because I know that there's a major construction irritation between my office and a classroom. So I will, arrive at the classroom to start my day's work on campus. That's about making different plans and coming up with solutions. But I'm sure that my sighted colleagues would probably do something similar. Get off at a different bus stop on campus, park their bike in a different place. I like knowing that these things are occurring.
Thanks for sharing that. And I want to circle back to Anne, though you're sighted. Are there aspects of the physical environment that make a space more or less accessible for you? Is this question relevant for you?
Well, yes and no. If we are walking on campus, obviously I can see the environment. There might be a deafblind student who has similar challenges to those that have been posed here today. But if I go into a coffee shop or a dining hall or a restaurant on campus and want to order food, sometimes you have to use a mobile app or speak. And when your order is ready, your name is called. And if there is no flashing light or other visual cue that my name is being called, sometimes I've gotten the wrong coffee order. I've ordered like a peppermint latte and received the wrong thing, or I misheard and thought like maybe the name was Andy, not Anne. And I have partial hearing. And so I would get a caramel macchiato instead of my peppermint latte. And then Andy will come and say, "You just tried to pilfer my coffee." And I'm standing there with his coffee in hand, and it can be awkward. So that's a barrier. I would love to have a flashing light or one of those buzzers that you get sometimes in a restaurant that vibrates when your table is ready. That would be very helpful for deaf students. Those are some proposed solutions that I would probably offer to help anybody in that situation. And also sometimes deaf people can be extremely light sensitive. So there are environments that aren't as friendly for deaf people. We sometimes have to ask the interpreter to wear black or a dark contrast color to be able to see their signs clearly, their hands clearly, instead of some kind of, polka dot neon blouse that's loud and visually noisy with a lot of colors. That can be very difficult for deaf people. Many deaf people rely on sign language to communicate, and they need that to be clear and to have high contrast. There are environments that are a little more distracting, or if the light is too bright, that can be distracting as well. So there are a variety of issues that relate to physical environment for deaf people for sure.
Thank you so much. Next, I want to move to another completely different question. This is one that was actually asked ahead of time, but it's such an important one. It's about networking. And they say it's crucial for success, but often challenging for those with disabilities. Do you have any tips for alternative ways to connect with peers and showcase your strengths? And perhaps we could start with Jonathan, who has talked to me before about the loneliness that can come along with being the first or being the only. And you've heard some of this from other young people in the sciences as well. Any tips?
We're all different. And I have to say that what might have worked for me, it's only going to be a might work for others. I've taken chances to try and prove to other people that I can. One great way to make sure that a conference is accessible is to be part of the organising committee. So I've been involved with helping run conferences on my own campus as the host institution. The last one of those, I was having learned from my past experiences of a large committee, I said to my collaborator, no, the committee will be 2, and if you want any more people, I'm leaving, because that gave me more influence over how to plan everything with one other person. Making sure that I am seen to be presenting, sticking my hand up when someone was looking for someone to facilitate a session, and saying, oh, I can do that. And yeah, it'll be different and it'll be done my way and it'll work because I'll make it work because I want to make it work. I, in unfamiliar environs, do need a sighted guide to get through a crowd, or people end up with a lot of cane whacking on their legs. It's much nicer to have an interaction with someone who can help guide you through a short space. So I do end up meeting some people at conferences over and over again, because I've actually found over the years that there are plenty of people in conference environs who, for reasons unknown to me, are equally feeling alone, and they're looking for an opportunity to connect as well. So I will and have taken the offer of a sighted guide as an assistant, a means of assistance, even when I didn't need it, because it was actually a part of networking. You know, my belligerent independence has to be put away at times in the name of networking, connecting, etc. But you're trying to be doing everything that everyone else expects and not allowing the tyranny of low expectation to rule my life is something I've invested in heavily.
Thank you for that. Anne, do you have any thoughts on this one? Any tips on networking?
Oh, sure. Yes. Networking, it's very important. I have a few suggestions. First of all, do not be afraid to approach a deaf person. Some people don't use their voice. Some people do use their voices. We come in all shapes and sizes. I would recommend that I'm speaking for myself as a deaf academic. I use auto transcriptions when I need to give my interpreters a break at a conference. Some deaf people might rely upon a team of interpreters so that there's always one available. You can, I've seen interpreters with them during networking hour at conferences, and they're, you know, using the interpreter is there to facilitate the networking and the communication between the deaf person and the person that they're trying to communicate with, and not there as a participant themselves. Also, I would request that people be patient. Sometimes texting back and forth can work, but that is a slower process and it requires some patience. If a person wants to communicate and they don't use their voice, my first tip is to ask that individual how they prefer to communicate, how best to communicate. And maybe even learn a little bit of sign language. It goes a long way. Another tip that I would have in networking situations for people who are deaf, take the time to email and correspond and say, oh, thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. So those are a few tips I have for people interacting with deaf people at conferences. Being the first person in my field, it was lonely. And I can relate to what Jonathan said in his experience, taking leadership positions to kind of prove that deaf people can do things. They can do this. They can, I become one of 3 wine educators out of a grad school club that had 27 different departments represented within it. And I took that leadership position in order to network and to, take on those leadership positions, even if I feel not completely confident. And it pays off.
Thank you so much. What about you, Venkatesh? Do you have any tips?
Yes. So I'll talk a little bit about networking, and I think it has many moving pieces, including proactivity from ourselves who want to network, things that conferences and event organizers can do to make networking more accessible, and things that some of us who are mentors or people who other people want to meet can also do, to make networking as a process more accessible. So I think one of the things that I would encourage people who want to network to do is to like reach out to uh, potential conference attendees, or like other people via email saying, hey, are you coming to this conference? Would you like to get coffee or would you like to chat? Can we schedule something? The responses will range all the way from, yes, let's put something on the calendar during the conference days to meet, to um, people being like, yes, let's meet and find something, in the conference, to that at least starting a conversation for the both of you to schedule something even at a later time. Now, in the case where people are being like, okay, let's find something at the conference, what I have seen happen is most of the time people who say this are very proactive. They probably have found me and are like, hey, um, do you want to chat? Like, do you want to chat tomorrow morning or today evening? So I think I personally always prefer to stay closer to the conference venue or in the conference hotel if that is possible. Again, I recognize that there are so many other factors that come into play in doing so, but just putting it out there, right? Like that's one of the things that's helpful, to meet with people and have a standard place. The other thing that has helped is also this has like been a growing process, but in the later years of my PhD, I've had friends and colleagues who would attend the same conference, who would understand that networking is hard, and who would help like find people that, oh, you can't plan this, right? Like you found somebody very interesting in a conference, you found somebody's talk very interesting, you want to chat with them. And they're probably not checking their email. So can your friends and like, can you build this peer-to-peer network of finding the other person that you want to meet, right? And um, other things that event spaces did or event spaces can do to make networking more inclusive and accessible, would be to have receptions and events with like sit down and stand up like circle tables. This has been very helpful. I've been in conferences where they've had tables and more senior people in the field were very, very intentional about going and like meeting newer people or people who may be, in their earlier stages of the career, having like circular tables sets an expectation that we are huddling in groups. So finding that and talking to people is a good way to like have a small group conversation. Yeah. So yeah, just some of the things, and also like picking spaces that are accessible to get to and in some ways inclusive, because a lot of the networking opportunities at events sometimes are also during like are very unstructured, right? Like they're happening after the sessions are over. Oh, let's get dinner, or let's go see this nice sightseeing place in this new city.
Mm. Thank you so much for that, Venkatesh. I see Anne is raising her hand, and then we're going to move to closing remarks. But yes, please share, Anne.
Thank you. I did want to add really quickly, with deaf people, they like a space that is circular and not linear, because then you can see everybody's faces. Round tables work very well for deaf people. We can see each other. So that is a point that I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. So we have so many other really interesting questions. I feel like we could talk for another hour and a half. This has been so interesting for me, but we have reached our time. So I'd like to move on to closing remarks, but I just want to add too that we do have a discussion board on the web page for this session on the accessibility website, and we can continue discussions there. And I think what we'll do is we'll share all of these questions with the panelists, and we'll post responses as you are able to provide them to that discussion board, so that we don't lose these great questions and we can still keep some of those conversations going. So on that note, let's move to closing remarks. And I wonder if Anne, if you would start us off.
I really want to express a great deal of gratitude to the people who came and were willing to listen and learn all of these different facts and things. Your questions, I love them. I love them. Please keep them coming. Do not be afraid to reach out to me or any of us with any questions. I enjoyed sharing my experiences with you, and thank you for being part of making change happen.
Thank you, Anne. Venkatesh, what are your closing thoughts?
Yeah, first I want to again, right, I echo what Anne said, and a huge thank you to everybody who has been here. And I also want to give a huge shout out to Shamsi, you for like organizing this, and your team for organizing this, and to my co-panelists for being here, because talking about accessibility is sometimes hard, and we are having this conversation. So kudos to the team for making this safe space. Kudos to you all for joining, and thank you my co-panelists for sharing how to navigate accessibility. The other thing that I do want to briefly say is that, I hope the past, as I promised when we started, I hope things are slightly more structured, slightly more cohesive, but after the hours conversations. But at the same time, I also hope that this time has been either a beginning or a waypoint in your accessibility journey, because I really hope to see a world, where all research is accessible. Thank you.
Thank you, Venkatesh. Jonathan, what are your closing thoughts?
In addition to all the appreciation for efforts like this, I think it would be remiss of me to let this session end without something that we haven't covered, which is the dangers of assumption. The reason why this session was called Ask Me Anything is because assumption has been the creator of problem. And if you start to assume about what works for me as an individual, without engaging with me as an individual, then you're not being very scientific. Asking us anything is what we volunteered to be doing in this session, and being available to answer questions, no matter how simple or complex they are. Questions and getting answers is human-to-human interaction. It's how science has advanced more rapidly with collaboration. And to collaborate with anyone, you have to learn how to work with them. And so I would leave you with two ideas: get rid of assumptions, or test your assumptions, and meet people halfway. So I look forward to answering questions once the session is over. Answering questions about my world is an important facet of being in my world. And change doesn't happen unless we want it to happen, and you won't change if you don't test your knowledge and your assumptions. So I'd say thank you, Shamsi, and your team. And I actually really look forward to the other sessions in the series. Just a small promo. So many exciting disabled people doing things over the next few days in the continuation of the series. Really looking forward to it. Thank you.
And I just want to say thank you also. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our volunteers and everyone who attended, and hope to see you at future sessions over the next 2 weeks. Thank you all so much. I really enjoyed this.